Hey, welcome to Real Estate Resource. Thanks for stopping by. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. I really hope you enjoy this video. So last week we finished looking at items included, like just the details, and this is what we're going over right now is the details, the explanations of the prior paragraphs that were really the terms of the agreement. So we're going through those explanation paragraphs that give you more detail about each one of those. So some of these we're going to jump through really quick because I want to try to finish. I'm going to do my damnedest to finish today, as a matter of fact. So let's jump in. I'm going to share my screen so you guys can see where we're at. And there we go. You should be right now looking at paragraph 10 and the end of paragraph 9 with the items included, excluded. Quickly, items excluded from sale, unless otherwise agreed, the following items are excluded: audio and video components, flat screen TV, speakers, other items. If any such item is not itself attached to the property, even if a bracket or other mechanism attached to the component or item is attached to the property, furniture and other items secured to the property for earthquake or safety purposes, unless otherwise specified in paragraph 3P1, brackets attached to walls, floors, or ceilings for any such component, furniture, item will be removed, and holes or other damage shall be repaired but not painted. So if you have a mounted TV, mounted speakers, you had a big, piece of furniture that was, mounted to the wall for earthquake safety, any of those things, those brackets can all be removed. They don't have to stay with the property, but those holes have to be filled. You just do not have to paint them. Okay, so that's the default. You don't have to paint them. You just have to repair the holes. You can't leave the holes. So just make sure that your clients are aware of that as they're removing furniture and TVs and anything else that's mounted to the wall. Okay, allocation of costs. This is where we get into that section of inspections, reports, certificates, all that stuff, like where we were talking about like the NHD report and the, if someone were to ask for a termite, this is what they're talking about here. In that report section, and it says right here in bold, it does not determine who is to pay for any work recommended or identified in any of the documents, any reports. Agreements for such payment or required work should be specified elsewhere in paragraph 3Q or 3R, or in a separate agreement such as CAR Form RR, request for repairs, the RRRR, which is the seller's response to buyer's request for repairs, ADM, which is an addendum, or AEA, which is my preference, is amendment to existing agreement terms, okay? Any reports of these paragraphs shall be delivered in the time specified in paragraph 3N1. The default of that is the 7 days that the seller has to provide those reports to you, okay? So the nice thing about all these descriptions is it takes you right back to the paragraph where we actually did the negotiating, where we filled out the actual terms of the offer at the beginning. Government requirements and corrective or remedial actions. Legally required installations and property improvements. Any required installation of smoke alarm or carbon monoxide device or securing of water heaters shall be completed within the time specified in paragraph 3 and 4. Now, by that default, it's in the first 7 days that has to be done, and paid for by the party specified in 3Q4. Again, going back, that's where you've checked off either seller or buyer to pay for that. If buyer is to pay for these items, buyers instructed by escrow holder, as instructed by, shall deposit funds into escrow or directly to the vendor completing the repair or installation prior to close of escrow. Seller shall deliver to buyer written statements of compliance in accordance with any law unless seller is exempt. If seller is to pay for these items and does not fulfill seller's obligation in the time specified and buyer incurs costs to comply with lender requirements concerning those items, seller shall be responsible for buyer's costs. In that reference, what they're talking about there is if one of those things, water heater bracing, smoke detector, or carbon monoxide installations, weren't done in time, the appraiser goes out, does the appraisal, and then comes back and says, hey, we need to have these things installed, and then has to come back for a reinspection. The seller's responsible for the cost of that reinspection if the seller was the one who was responsible for paying and installing those things. Okay. Point of sale inspections, those are the pre-sale inspection reports. That's what they're talking about there. Point of sale inspections, reports, and repairs refer to any such actions required to be completed before or after close of escrow that are required in order to close under law and paid by parties specified in paragraphs 3Q5 and 3Q6. Unless parties otherwise agree to another time period, any such repair shall be completed prior to final verification of property. If buyer agrees to pay for any portion of such repair, buyer shall directly pay to the vendor completing the repair or provide an invoice to escrow holder, deposit funds into escrow sufficient to pay for completing the repair, buyer's portion of such repair, and request escrow holder pay the vendor completing the repair. So you could do it both. I could say, hey, I'm going to pay directly to the guy to get it done, or I could put money into escrow and tell escrow, hey, pay them at the end. Okay. Buyer shall be provided within the time specified in 3N1, unless otherwise agreed to another time period, a copy of any required government conducted or point of sale inspection report prepared pursuant to this agreement or in anticipation of the sale of the property. So that's, again, going back to 3N1, is the seller's time periods of when they have to provide those reports to the buyer. So that's 7 days by default. And what it says there, it's like, hey, if you ordered this report because this escrow opened, then you have to give it to us. Or if you did one prior to, just in preparation for selling the property, that's the one you have to give to us. Here's a reference again to reinspection fees. If any repair in paragraph 10B1 is not completed when the time specified and the lender requires additional inspection to be made, seller shall be responsible for any corresponding reinspection fee. Okay, so keep that in mind, that the seller is going to be responsible if they delay any of these things that they've agreed to. Information and advice on requirements. Buyer and seller are advised to seek information from a knowledgeable source regarding local and state mandates and whether they are point of sale requirements or requirements of ownership. Agents do not have expertise in this area and cannot ascertain all the requirements or costs of compliance. So, for example, City of Los Angeles that has a certificate of compliance that's required, and that's the low flow plumbing fixtures, it's the gas shutoff valve, those things. There are companies that do those specific repairs to get you in compliance. So that would be more of a reference. If you're talking about like city requirements, I know we're not responsible, but we should know that stuff, what Compton requires, what Inglewood requires, what Huntington Park requires. What we should do, though, is refer the seller back to the city to say, if you need any more details other than that, because this is the basics of how it works, the cost of the report, ordering the report and who's responsible for that. Anything else as far as who can do the repairs or can this be waived, that should be information that comes directly from the city to the seller, not through you, because if there's a miscommunication in any way, then you become responsible. Okay. The home warranty plan, they can choose for optional coverages and whoever they write to and agree in that paragraph of 3Q18. I wanted to get past that because it's not super important. That's very easy to explain. But the statutory disclosures are where we're going to probably spend most of the time, even though I'm hoping to get through this. Okay, so the statutory and other disclosures, which include the lead-based paint disclosure and cancellation rights. That's where all of this stuff is going to go. The seller, I'm just going to paraphrase this top section there. The seller shall, within the time specified in 3A1, deliver to buyer a TDS, an NHD statement. Now, that NHD statement is a separate form than the NHD report that we normally use, but that NHD report is an acceptable substitute for the NHD statement. The NHD statement is actually filled out by the seller. They have to answer the questions on, if it's in an earthquake zone, is it in a high fire? They have to be the ones responsible for sharing that information with the buyer. So we have NHD reports that we've already agreed upon and earlier in the contract that will be a good substitute or an acceptable substitute for that. So TDS, NHD report, an SPQ, an ESD, right? An SPQ or an ESD. So an SPQ, the seller's property questionnaire, that's required for any seller that is not exempt, meaning if you are a trust that is selling, but it's the original trustee, they still have to do an SPQ. They still have to do a TDS. If they are a trust with a successor trustee who has made that his primary residence, they still are required to do a TDS and an SPQ. If it is a REO or a successor trustee that didn't live in the property selling a trust, then they are allowed to bypass the TDS and do an ESD instead of the seller's property questionnaire, the SPQ. The ESD is an exempt seller's disclosure. It's a shorter version of the SPQ and has some items that are required to be answered. The other thing that they're required to is the FHDS, which is the fire hardening disclosures, right? You have to provide those. You have to disclose if there's any Belarus. You have to disclose if there's any military. All that stuff will fall under the SPQ or the ESD. So these are mandated disclosures that have to be provided. The lead-based paint, which shows up a little bit later, the lead-based paint, and the ESD and the NHD are required for every transaction, right? Well, let me rephrase that. The NHD report and the lead-based paint are required for every transaction, whether that be a probate, an REO, a trust. They still have to provide that. And in addition to those, a trust, a probate, or an REO also have to provide the ESD, the exempt seller's disclosure. Any other transaction is going to require the lead-based paint, the NHD, the TDS, and an SPQ, plus the FHDS. That FHDS is also going to be required probably in those other transactions also. What I wanted to highlight here, which you can see I highlighted in blue, is the real estate transfer disclosure statement, the TDS. Because I've mentioned this to you guys before, but I want to show you where it's in the contract. The TDS required by this paragraph is considered fully completed if seller has completed the section titled coordination with other disclosure forms and checking box, and we'll go into that in the disclosure class. Checking a box in section 1, and seller has completed and answered all questions and signed the seller's information section 2, and the seller's agent, if any, has completed and signed the seller's agent section 3, or if applicable, an agent's visual inspection disclosure form. Section 5, acknowledgement of receipt of copy of the TDS shall be signed after all previous sections of applicable have been completed. Nothing stated here relieves buyer's agent, if any, from the obligation to conduct a reasonably competent and diligent visual inspection of the accessible areas of the property and disclose on Section 4 of the TDS or an avid material facts affecting the value, desirability of the property that were or should have been revealed by such an inspection, or completing these sections on disclosures required to be completed by buyer's agent. So what it says in this paragraph is basically the TDS is not complete without the avids. So I know that I've tried to stress that to you guys before, how important the avid is, because we deal with it all the time, and people watching this video, I'm sure they have done it also, is they wait to turn into their avid till the last minute, or they don't do their avid, or they forget about their avid. The problem is that you don't have a complete TDS. So if I'm saying to a buyer that you've been delivered all disclosures, but there is no avid from the listing agent, there's no avid from the buyer's agent, then they haven't been given completed disclosures. So you got to keep that in mind. Okay, you have to keep that in mind. Seller shall, within the time specified in 3N1, provide supplemental disclosures as followed. Unless exempt from the obligation to provide a TDS, complete a seller property questionnaire by answering all questions and signing delivery copy to buyer. If exempt from the obligation to provide a TDS, complete an exempt seller disclosure by answering all questions and signing and delivering a copy. So it's just saying, like, hey, if you don't have to do a TDS, you still are required to do this in that same time period. And as a seller, as a listing agent, if they're not required to do a TDS, I'm still required to do an avid. That doesn't absolve me of doing my duty because they don't have to do a TDS. In the event, I'm going to let you guys ask questions after I finish C4 here. In the event seller or seller's agent prior to close of escrow becomes aware of adverse conditions materially affecting the property or any material inaccuracy in disclosures, information, or representations previously provided to buyer under this paragraph shall, in writing, promptly provide a subsequent or amended TDS, seller property questionnaire, or other document in writing covering those items. Any such document shall be deemed an amendment to the TDS or SPQ. However, a subsequent or amended disclosure should not be required for conditions and material inaccuracies of which buyer is otherwise aware, or which are discovered by buyer or disclosed in reports or documents provided to or ordered and paid for by buyer. So basically what they're saying is that if anything comes up, I've given you my TDS, I've given you my SPQ, we're done. And in that period since I've delivered that document to you, I find out something else about the property. Either there's a new leak or some other kind of damage or something that may change the desirability of the property in the eyes of the buyer. I have to amend those disclosures and send them over. What I don't have to do is, if for some reason, let's say that the buyer does a professional home inspection, and during that inspection, the buyer finds out, because they're there for the inspection, they find out that there's a horrible leak underneath the house that we as sellers didn't know about. It wasn't disclosed in any of the paperwork. And they call the seller or the listing agent and they say, hey, listen, there's a giant leak under there. We're going to get the report back soon, but we need you guys to fix that leak. I am not required in this transaction to amend my disclosure because I know about this leak now. That's not how it works. I found out because of something that the buyer had paid for to have done. Now, if this deal falls apart and I go into another escrow, then I'm required to amend my disclosure prior to sending to that new buyer and let them know about this leak that I'm now aware of. You could do that one of two ways. You could amend your TDS, or now with your TDS, you can attach a copy of the home inspection report that was done by that buyer that shows that leak, okay? So keep in mind, the lead disclosures are required for any residential property built before January 1st, 1978. That's 1 through 4 units. If it was built after 78, you don't need to do the lead anymore. That's it. It's prior to 78, you have to provide that lead-based paint disclosure to everybody. The home fire hardening disclosure and advisory, that's required only if your NHD report shows that you're in a high or very high fire danger zone in the NHD report. If it's not in there, if it's not in that section, you're not required to provide it, but you can provide it, okay? Same with the defensible space disclosure and addendum. Those things are the same. This is important to understand, that the disclosures that are referenced, right? So we're in paragraph 11 here. So everything in 11A, so 11A1, 11B, 11C, 11D, you cannot waive them. It is prohibited by law to waive those disclosures. So if you ever have a seller that's saying, oh, you're not getting disclosures because this was an investment property and we know nothing about it, so we want you to sign a waiver, even if you sign that waiver, because that waiver is prohibited by law, okay, they could still be held liable for non-disclosure. Okay, so you cannot waive TDS, NHD, lead-based paint, SPQ. Those cannot be waived. Okay, buyer shall, within the time specified in paragraph 3L4 or 5 days after delivery, that's the buyer's contingency periods, whatever you guys agree to for investigations and inspections, you have to sign and return in that same time period, or 5 days after delivery of any of the disclosures, whichever is later. Okay, so if they were late with the disclosures, then you get 5 days after, or your original contingency period, whichever is later. Okay, the termination rights. Statutory disclosures. If any disclosure specified in paragraphs L, A, B, C, or D, or subsequent or amended disclosures to those just specified is delivered to buyer after the offer is signed, buyer shall have the right to terminate this agreement within 3 days after delivery in person, or 5 days after delivery by deposit in the mail or by electronic record or email, satisfying the we're not going to read that part. So basically, the important part is this. If you get statutory disclosures, lead-based paint, TDS, NHD, SPQ, any of those, Mello-Roos, whatever it is, the FHSD, the fire hardening, you get any of those. If you get them in the email, which all of you do, I don't know anybody that delivers these by hand, but if for some reason a listing agent walks over and hands them to you and says, here's all the disclosures, you've got 3 days from that occurrence to just cancel based on what on receiving the disclosures. If I assign the disclosures and send them back the same day, that 3 day, 5 days, doesn't matter. I can only use my right of rescission, cancel the deal, if I haven't approved the disclosures yet. So keep in mind that I get all the disclosures. Now, we all know we all get them by email, so we're only going to look at that 5-day period. I receive all of the statutory disclosures, everything that's referenced in paragraphs L, A, B, and 11, A, B, C, or D. I get those today. Tomorrow's day 1, Saturday's day 2, Sunday's day 3, Monday's day 4, even though it's and Tuesday's day 5, even though it is a holiday. If within that 5-day period, I don't rescind, but I sign all the disclosures and send it back, I have now waived my right to rescind. And the only way I can cancel is based on my contingencies at that point. So you guys have to understand that either you're going to use your right of rescission or you're going to sign and return them, but you can't sign and return them and say, oh, well, we're still within our rescission period. Once you do that, you've waived your rescission period, okay? Because you've accepted those disclosures. So know that. Okay, questions about all of those statutory contingencies. How many? Well, look, somebody put how often, how many days would you recommend for the AVID? Within the first 7 days, it has to be part of the TDS. So, I mean, the timelines are what the timelines are. So your AVID needs to be done in the first 7 days. If you're doing it outside of that, then that means that the TDS is late because it's incomplete, being delivered to the buyer. So if you guys aren't doing your AVID in the first 7 days, then you're not doing it right because your disclosures are incomplete. That's it. Okay, any other questions about that? Withholding taxes, we're not going to go into how that works 100%. Just know that you either as a buyer's agent have to receive a seller's affidavit that is fully executed, which means it has the seller's social security number, it has their signature, it has everything on it. You have to receive that, or you have to receive a form called the QS, which is a qualified substitute. And what that is that escrow, they're the only legit qualified substitutes. They are signing that they are attesting to the fact that they have a fully executed seller's affidavit, which shows all the correct information is required, and they will provide it to Franchise Tax Board or the IRS when required. That's all this is going to talk about. That's all that's talking about in the withholding taxes. Question, can you do an AVID during the listing period? You could do an AVID anytime you want prior to delivering it to the buyer. So if I take a listing today and I go do my AVID today, it's still a valid AVID when I turn it over as long as nothing's changed. If anything's changed, then I amend my AVID. So yes, you can. Megan's Law, don't need to read that. All it is saying in that is if you want to know about Megan's Law, whether they're sex offenders in your neighborhood, go to this website, meganslaw.ca.gov. As agents, you guys shouldn't be going on that website because if you go on the website and you look at it, you're now technically required to disclose that. So keep in mind that information. And if that's the reason why your buyers want to cancel because they go on the Megan's Law database, just tell them, hey, if that's why you're canceling, just don't tell me, just tell me you want to cancel, okay? Because I don't want to know that there's a sex offender in the area. The transmission lines, again, that's another one that's, here's a notice. There may be gas and hazardous liquid transmission lines around here. Go to this website to see where they are on the map and if that affects this property. The natural and environmental hazards, this is talking about the NHD report or statement that they may get. The earthquake, the lead-based paint booklet, all of those booklets that we provide to them as seller. That's just a list of what those are, okay? The condominium and the PUD disclosures, again, just talking about the timelines that go back. And any restrictions are supposed to be disclosed either in the SPQ or ESD. That means known restrictions from a condominium or a PUD, like deed restrictions or any kind of covenants that could affect the desirability of the property. If the seller knows those, they're required to disclose them also, not just lay back and wait on the paperwork that comes from the HOA, okay? Solar system. For any properties with solar panels or solar power systems, seller shall within the time specified in 3N1, which is 7 days, deliver to buyer all known information about the solar panels or solar system. Seller may use the solar advisory and questionnaire, CAR form, SOLAR, or solar. It's a very creative name, but easy to remember. Known material facts. Seller shall, within time specified in 3N1, 7 days, again, disclose known material facts and defects affecting the property, included but not limited to known insurance claims within the past 5 years, or provide buyer with permission to contact insurer to get such information. CAR Form ARC, authorization to receive and convey information, and make any and all other disclosures required by law. Okay. So that's it. That's everything that the seller has to provide, the timelines they have to do it, how that works. The reason that I wanted to really highlight the idea that the TDS is not complete without your AVID is because I know that everybody waits till the last minute to do their AVID. Well, let's not say everybody, but the majority of agents are not doing their AVID in a timely manner and doing it when they're supposed to. So what you're doing by not doing your AVID, especially as listing agent, what you're doing is you're leaving the door open for more time for the buyer's agent to not have to remove contingencies because they don't have a complete AVID. I mean, a complete TDS. Okay, so please just keep that in mind. And again, any time you guys have questions about that, you could always go back to anything about the disclosures. You go back to paragraph 11, and that's where it's at. You're going to answer all your questions about any of the disclosures in paragraph 11. Paragraph 12, again, is just, these are the buyer's investigation to the property, of property and the matters affecting the property. 3L3 is the days that you guys have agreed to in that time period, which is by default 17 unless you made it anything different. And this is just going to give you a list of what the seller, a small list of what the buyer has the ability to do. But the most important thing in here is this: without seller's prior written consent, buyers shall neither make nor cause to be made invasive or destructive buyer investigations, except for minimally invasive testing required to prepare a pest control report, which shall not include any holes or drilling through stucco or similar material, or inspections by government building or zoning inspectors or government employees unless required by law. So what that's saying is, I can't go to the city and say, hey, you know what, I think that they have an illegal structure in the property, and then cause the city to go there, do an inspection. If there's a city pre-sale already required, then that's going to come up because you're going to do that. But I can't bring the city in. I can't call the city and say, hey, I need you to inspect this because I think it's not legal. If I do that, I as buyer could be held liable for any of the costs or fixing that stuff. If I'm going to do inspections, and I'm allowed to do any inspection I want as buyer, as long as I don't do damage. As you see there, I can't drill into stuff. I can't cause damage to the property as part of my inspection. If I do, I'm responsible for fixing it. Okay. Seller shall make the property available for all buyers' investigations. That's it. You cannot, as seller, say, no, you don't have access. Okay. But what I'm not required to do is to move stuff around. Right? I don't have to move my personal property in order to make your inspection easier. But I am required to have all of the utilities working and have the pilot lights on for them to do the inspections. As a matter of fact, it's supposed to stay on through the entire escrow. It says right here, for all buyers' investigations and through data possession. Okay? The buyer has a certain amount of time to do all of their stuff. Buyers shall, by the time specified in 3L3, that's either the 17 or whatever you've negotiated, complete all their investigations and satisfy themselves to the condition of the property and either remove the contingency or cancel. By the time specified in 3L3 or 3 days after receipt of any investigation report, whichever is later, give seller at no cost complete copies of all such reports obtained by buyer, which obligation shall survive the termination of this agreement. This delivery of investigation reports shall not include any appraisal except an appraisal received in connection with an FHA or VA loan. So the only time that the buyer is required to give the seller a copy of the appraisal is if they're requesting for the price to be reduced, or they're canceling because the price didn't come in, or if it's an appraisal that's part of an FHA or VA loan. Every other report that the buyer does is required. So as a listing agent, what I would always say is in your counters, you counter back that they have to give you a copy of the appraisal, whether the deal cancels or doesn't, or closes, that you get a copy of that appraisal. I would ask for it. The next one is the buyer indemnity, and really all that's saying is that the buyer is responsible for anybody that they bring onto the property. So if I hire a home inspector or anybody else to come on the property to do work and they cause damage or get hurt, I'm responsible for that, not the seller. Which means is that for me as buyer, anybody that I'm hiring as a third party to come onto the property and to do work there or to do inspections, I need to make sure that they are insured, because otherwise I ultimately become responsible. So if I bring somebody onto the property that is not insured, right, and they fall and get hurt, and they sue the seller's homeowner's insurance, and the seller has to pay off that homeowner's insurance, and their homeowner's insurance goes up or whatever the case is, I, as buyer, would be responsible for damages that they incurred. So if the insurance company had to pay out a certain amount, the insurance company could come back after the buyer to get made whole in a suit. So if they paid $100,000, they could sue the buyer for $100,000 for bringing somebody on that was not insured. I am indemnifying and protecting the seller. Okay, so you've got to explain that to your buyers, especially the ones that are like, oh no, I got a buddy that does roofs and I give him a case of beer and he'll go inspect the roof, but he's not licensed, and that buddy falls off the roof. The seller could be the buyer could be responsible for any damages incurred to the seller, right? Or if they do damage to the roof, right? They say they go up on the roof to do inspections and they cause damage and it makes a leak. I could be held responsible as buyer. Go ahead, Jesus.
I'm sorry, now that we're talking about lawsuits, it's not about this precisely, but what if or signs, they are standing in the corner and the wind blows them and hits a car, and what is insurance that covers us, and what percentage of that?
Couldn't tell you. I have no idea how that works. I mean, I guess we have general liability insurance for the company. So, I mean, if that's something that we could use, maybe. But as far as I know, I don't know that it's going to protect, that there is insurance that protects you from a sign blowing over and damaging a car. Don't know. So you'd probably have to look at the liability insurance that we have as a company. And for those of you that don't work here and you're looking at this video on YouTube, I'm stumped. Don't know what insurance protection you have from that.
Thank you.
Okay. The title investing, the only thing that I look at in the title investing that's important is we know that the preliminary title report has to be delivered in a certain amount of time to the buyer, right? We know that 7 days, and the buyer has to review that, and they have the 17 days and all that stuff. What's important on here is that the contract dictates what kind of homeowner's policy of title insurance the seller is to provide. So if they're going to try to provide anything other than an ALTA, CLTA homeowner's policy, then it has to be agreed to in writing. That's the one that they're required to provide. Okay. That's really the most important part. We know the timelines, but that's just to make sure that we are getting the proper title insurance. Okay. The time periods and removal of contingencies and cancellation rights. This is where everything is. The seller delivery of documents, we know it's 7 days, but if you want to know what's required in that 7 days, it's everything right here. It's all of these paragraphs. Okay? Paragraph 7A, 9B6, 10, 11A, 11B, 11C, 11D, 11H, 11K, 11L, 11M, 11N, 13A, 13C, and 28. That's the stuff that all has to be provided in the delivery of documents in that 7 days. That's it. Okay? For the buyer has to review all of that stuff that's in there in their period of time, whatever that was agreed upon, either the default 17 or whatever you guys agree to. The continuation of contingency, though, is important for everybody to know. Even after the end of the time specified in 3L, which is, again, the 17 or whatever you guys negotiated days, And before seller cancels, if at all, pursuant to paragraph 14C, and we're going to talk about that right now, buyer retains the right in writing to either remove the remaining contingencies or cancel this agreement based on a remaining contingency. Once buyer's written removal of contingencies delivered to seller, seller may not cancel this agreement pursuant to 14C1. We're going to talk about that next. So what it's saying is this: if we're 24 days in and I haven't removed my contingency in writing, the seller hasn't requested me to remove my contingency in writing and then subsequently cancels, I still have that contingency. Doesn't matter how long we are in escrow. If I haven't removed it in writing, it still exists. Okay? Now, the seller's right to cancel based on those contingencies is right here. In order to cancel, the seller has to first give me a notice to buyer to perform. If the buyer doesn't perform, then the seller can cancel. That's it. Okay? Same thing goes for any contractual obligations. That just means anything else that's done by timeline, right? I can send you a notice to perform and cancel. Okay? So here's contractual obligations. Buyer doesn't take the following actions. Deposit the funds in 3D1. I don't deposit my initial deposit. I can send notice to buyer to perform and cancel. Okay? That's also if they're not good, right? If you send a bad check in for the funds. Okay? Buyer doesn't deliver an updated contact information for buyer's lender as required in 5C. Deliver a notice of FHA VA costs or terms, if any, as specified in paragraph 5C. CAR Form RR, deliver verification or a satisfactory verification of seller reasonably to produce approves of the verification already provided as required by paragraph 5B or 6A. Deliver a letter as required by paragraph 6B in writing. Assume or accept leases or liens, paragraph 8G, right? That's the contingency of the leased or liened items. If you don't return any of the statutory or other disclosures as required in time, that's also contractual obligation. I can send a notice to buyer to perform. If I didn't do liquidated damages, right? So any of these things that have a specific timeline, if I don't do them, it doesn't have to be a contingency. It could just be a contractual obligation. I can send a notice to buyer to perform. If they don't perform, the seller can cancel. Okay. The other way the seller can cancel if the seller has a seller contingency of another, buying another property my mind just went blank. Seller's purchase of replacement property is in effect. It's in writing with the contract. The buyer's right to cancel. If there's seller's contingencies and the seller's not removing them, I can send a notice to seller to perform, and if they don't perform, remove that contingency of finding a replacement property or closing on replacement property, then I can cancel. Okay. Buyer's right to cancel for contractual obligations. Also, if the seller's supposed to deliver stuff in 7 days and they don't, and I send them a notice to seller to perform, I can cancel. Okay. And then with the contingencies, buyer may cancel his agreement by good faith exercise of any buyer contingency included in paragraph 8 or otherwise agreed, so long as the contingency has not already been removed in writing. Okay. The notice to buyer or seller to perform, it used to have an ability to change it, but now it's 2 days. Is 2 days. That's it. 2 days after delivery, and I cannot send it 2 days prior to the contractual obligation or contingency date. Okay, so on both sides, if I send you a notice to perform, it cannot be more than 2 days prior to your contractual obligation or your contingency. So that would mean for a seller, I could send it on day 5, right? To say you're going to send it to me on day 7, all your reports and everything. If it's a contingency and I'm sending it to the buyer, I can send it on day 15 if the contingency periods are day 17. If we're past those dates, then I have to give them at least 2 days for them to perform. Okay, that both goes notice to buyer and notice to seller. And it used to be you could change that to 1 day or 2 days. You can't anymore in the contract. You could in a counteroffer. You could say that all notices to perform are 24 hours. But remember, that works both ways for the buyer and for the seller. So 24 hours, you can do that. This is just talking about if you remove the contingencies, what that means is now you're responsible. You're accepting the property in the condition that it's in. It doesn't matter, even if you get disclosures later after you remove the contingency. You've removed the contingency, and you're only able to cancel for the disclosures based on the statutory ones, which we just talked about. So that would be the 3-day and 5-day red rescission, depending on how they were delivered. If seller removes any of their contingencies or cancellation rights and otherwise agreed in writing, seller shall be conclusively deemed to have satisfied themselves regarding that contingency, elected to proceed with the transaction, and given up any right to cancel this agreement based on such contingency. So same thing for buyer and seller. If you remove the contingencies, we're assuming you've decided you're happy with the condition of the property and the information that you've received, and you've decided to move forward and close escrow. And now once you cancel after that fact, you're in breach of the contract, which means that you could be forfeiting your deposit. Okay. Demand to close escrows. In this, all that we're going to use now, remember, a demand to close escrow is only for close of escrow. You do not use a notice to perform for that. I still hear buyers and agents and listing agents talking about sending notices to perform to close escrow. You don't do that. You use a demand to close escrow. And in a demand to close escrow, it's 3 days, either 3 days after delivery, or you can send it 3 days prior to your contractual close date, and that's it. Once you do that, if they don't close, you have the right to cancel. Okay? When you cancel, if you are supposed to release the deposit either to the seller because you breached the contract buyer and removed all your contingencies, or seller, they haven't removed any contingencies and the deal is canceling, you have to give them their deposit back. If you have no right to the deposit, in big bold letters right here, it says a party may be subject to a civil penalty of up to $1,000 for refusal to sign cancellation instructions if no good faith dispute exists as to which party is entitled to the deposited funds. Note, neither agents nor escrow holder are qualified to provide any opinion on whether either party has acted in good faith or which party is entitled to the deposited funds. Buyer and seller are advised to seek advice of qualified California real estate attorney regarding this matter. All it's saying is that, look, if you're not supposed to keep the deposit and you don't release it and we have to go fight over it and the judge deems it true that you weren't supposed to hold on to it, they could put an additional $1,000 penalty on top of releasing the deposit. Okay, so just keep that in mind. As far as Darwin, you're unmuted. Did you have a question?
Usually, how many days do you have from the seller to release the deposit to the buyer? Like how many days?
There is no days.
How many days can you?
There is no days. There is no days. There's no notice to perform for it. There's no demand. There is nothing. There is no days. You put it in the cancellation. If they don't respond in a certain amount of time, then you can go the dispute resolution route. But there is no stated time that the seller has to respond to a cancellation or to escrow's request to release the deposit. None. Zero. So there's no paperwork to do after that. Once you send it in, if they don't respond, you just have to decide how long you want to wait for them to decide before you decide to file either a small claims lawsuit or start the process of dispute resolution, which is mediation arbitration. Okay. The repairs in paragraph 15 have to be done prior to the final walkthrough, and they have to be done in a workmanlike manner. That's it. And you have to provide all of the paperwork from whoever does the work to the buyers at the final walkthrough. The final walkthrough is not a contingency of the sale and should be done within the time specified in 3J, which is 5 days prior to close of escrow. That's it. Proration of property taxes, that's going to talk about what happens in escrow with paid property taxes and Mello-Roos and how those get prorated. This is about the compensation and scope of duty. It talks about what we're required to do as buyers and listing agents, brokerages, and how we get paid. Okay. The joint escrow instructions, this is where escrow is going to pull the escrow instructions from, these paragraphs right here. Okay. So if you look at your escrow instructions and they don't reference exactly what's in that paragraph, then you have to talk to escrow and make sure that they match. Our escrow now is actually using the paragraphs from the purchase agreement as the escrow instruction. Does seller have to respond to the request for repairs? No, seller does not have to respond to a request for repairs. It does say in there, Seller should respond in 5 days, but there's nothing that requires them to respond. Okay. We're not going to worry about the escrow. The escrow instructions are for escrow. Just know that you have to look at these paragraphs to make sure that that escrow has got the correct information in there. Okay. Selection of service providers. Agents don't guarantee the performance of the vendors, right? So what they're saying is like, hey, we're not responsible for the vendors, but if you're the only one that's choosing them, you become responsible. So please make sure you're saying to your sellers and your buyers, here's 3 vendors, pick one. I'm okay with any of them. Okay. Attorney fees and costs. Everybody's going to pay their own attorney fees. That's how that's going to work. Okay. The assignment and nomination. If you're not assigning it to your own entity, right? So we know that the seller, the buyer has the right to do an assignment in the first 17 days. If they're assigning it to their own entity, meaning I have a trust or I wholly own the entity, I have no partners, right? So, for example, I write an offer on your property as Kyle Estrada, but I want to transfer it now into my trust. I can do that without your approval, without the seller approving it. If I want to assign it into my corporation and I'm the only officer of that corporation, the seller does not have to give me approval. But if it's anybody else, if I'm adding a co-borrower, if I'm removing a buyer, if I'm adding a buyer or buyers, if I'm moving it into a corporation where I'm not the only person that's on corp, I have to get the approval of the seller to sign that, and they would do that on the AOAA. Now, should you still do an assignment of agreement addendum when you're switching it into your own thing? Yes, just so it's easier for escrow, but I don't have to get the seller's permission if it's my own entity, my own trust, my own corporation. Okay. If it's somebody else outside, I do have to get their acceptance, and I have to disclose if I'm making any money on that. Equal housing opportunity. This property is sold with the compliance of the federal, state, and local anti-discrimination laws. We all know that. These are all the definitions of what's in the contract, so you can have your clients read that. The one that's the most important is the counting of days. Okay. Counting of days is right here. It's listed. Okay. Is done as follows, unless otherwise. The first day after an event is the first full calendar date following the event and ending at 11:59. For example, if a notice to buyer to perform is delivered at 3 p.m. on the 7th calendar day of the month, or acceptance of a counteroffer is personally received at 12 noon on the 7th calendar day of the month, then the 7th day is 0 for purposes of counting days to respond to the NBP or calculating the close of escrow date or contingency removal dates, and the 8th day of the month is day 1 for those same purposes. So it's just really easy. Acceptance date is, if I get it accepted today, signed by everybody today, tomorrow is day 1. So whatever happens today, whether it means I receive a notice of buyer to perform or we accept a contract, everything is, this is day 0. Tomorrow would be day 1, okay? Day or days means calendar days, just so you guys know. Delivered, or delivery is when you receive them, okay? The electronic copy or electronic signature means as applicable. The signers, all this stuff is just here for definition. So if they need to clarify any of the terms that are in the contract. Terms and conditions of the offer, it just means like, hey, listen, there's nothing matters outside of this agreement. It has to be in writing, okay? Here, this is talking about dispute resolutions, and right, if at least one party but not all parties initial that little right addendum of the dispute resolution or liquidated damages, you have to counter it. That's what they're saying. So if one party initials, the other party doesn't, you got to counter it. Okay. Time is of the essence, and contract changes, all this stuff. Neither this agreement nor any provision in it may be extended, amended, modified, altered, or changed except in writing and signed by buyer and seller. Just want to reiterate that. Like, this is just, again, all of the stuff is included in this, and you can't change it without both parties signing it. This is just description of the legally authorized signer. We've talked about that, right? If there's an entity and who's authorized to sign on behalf of that. Liquidated damages. This is what we're talking about, the initials. Both parties have to initial or no parties initial. It can't be one or the other. Okay, you have to either everybody initials or nobody does. And liquidated damages is what it says is that you're agreeing to forfeit your deposit if you breach the contract. And it's a limit of 3% of the purchase price, but only if it's 1 to 4 units and the buyer is going to occupy one of those 1 to 4 units. If it's an investor, they're not protected by this. Their 3% is not protected. That cap doesn't exist. So understand that. Even if I initial liquidated damages as an investor, I'm not protected to that 3% cap on my deposit. Okay? That's only for people who are going to be occupying one of the 1 to 4 units. Okay? Mediation is required no matter what. No matter if we're going through arbitration of disputes in paragraph 31, or we're gonna waive that and we're gonna go through litigation, mediation is required first. And if you refuse to do mediation, you cannot recover your legal fees, even if you win during that arbitration or lawsuit. Okay. This arbitration of disputes, by initialing this paragraph, basically what we're saying is that we're not going to litigate, we're going to arbitrate. So that means we're not going to get in front of a judge or a jury. We're going to get an independent arbitrator, which is usually not the same person, but from the same pool as a mediator. It's a retired judge, it's a retired attorney that are going to hear our case, and they're going to make a decision, and that arbitration is binding just as if it were a lawsuit, a litigation, okay? There really isn't much benefit to it. It's slightly shorter, it's slightly less expensive, but not nominally. So it's just really becomes the preference of your client. So you have to tell them that. You can't force them to initial or not. It's up to them. Now, if they write an offer without initialing that as buyer and the seller requests it, then they would be required to do the arbitration of disputes instead of litigation. Let's just finish real quick, and then you guys can ask any questions. This is just about the expiration of offer. Okay, we already talked about that date earlier in paragraph 3C. If there is an entity buyer, like we talked about, where it's a trust or it's a corporation or whatever is buying it, then we have to check this box, and then we have to name who the signer or signers will be of that entity. Okay. Buyer signs. If it's the entity, then you check this box and it prints the name of the legal signer, and then it's signed by that person. If we're accepting it as the seller, we're going to check off boxes for either if there's a counter offer or a backup offer, addendum attached. If there's entity sellers, then we're going to check that box, and we're going to include the information for who the authorized signers are on behalf of the entity, and then they're going to sign. If the offer is not accepted by the seller needs to initial this, date it, and you need to send this page back to the buyer's agent. This is just information of who the brokers are, both representing the buyers and the sellers. One thing that I would always require is this designated electronic delivery address, because then it states when things are received and not, as long as you send to those numbers that are there, number or email that's there, okay? The information for everybody, the escrow holder's information, and this is the proof of the presentation of an offer by the agent or the seller and what date those were presented. Okay, Jesus, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
Since it shows there about the name and the trustee when it's an entity, when it's LLC or a corp, do we put president or?
Well, whatever their title is, the authorized signature, whoever that person is, whatever it is. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions, guys? Anybody have other questions? I know we kind of ran through that quickly, but you can go through and rewatch those videos. I'll have it up on YouTube later today. Really, I mean, the meat and potatoes of this purchase agreement we covered weeks ago, which was, you know, filling it out and what goes in paragraph 3. Those are the terms that everybody's agreeing upon. But this is just so you guys have some reference to what the explanations for each one of those paragraphs are, so that you can help explain that to your client as you're, you know, going through and getting ready to present these offers. Look, as a listing agent, as a buyer's agent, you got to be able to explain all of these paragraphs, right? Because if I'm presenting to a seller, I've got to explain to them what these things mean. And if I'm having a buyer sign a contract, I have to explain to them what it is that they're signing and initialing and agreeing to as we submit it. Any other questions about the purchase agreement before we sign off? Because we're not going to have, it looks like we're not going to have contract class for the next 2 weeks, at least that long. It might be longer. Maybe we're going to have a class next week. I'm not sure, but it looks like, oh no, I think there's a lunch and learn. If there's no lunch and learn, there'll be a class. Otherwise, it's probably going to be 2 or 3 weeks before we have another class. And then what we're going to do in that class is we're going to review all of the updated and new documents that came into play in June. So if you guys don't need anything else from me, I will let you go. And again, you can catch up on these videos on YouTube. So thank you guys for joining me. I appreciate it. Have a great and productive day.